song goes like this.
Guarda che luna, guarda che mare, da questa notte senza te dovrò restare.
Good morning. Good morning. My name is Diane Abbott. I am the Member of Parliament for Hackney North and Stoke Newington and Labour's Shadow Home Secretary. It's a great pleasure to be here in Northampton, but it gives me even greater pleasure to introduce one of my oldest friends, an extraordinary, transformative leader of the Labour Party, and the next Prime Minister of this country, Jeremy Corbyn!
Thank you, Diane, for that introduction, and thank you to the Saints for giving us space this morning. I stopped at the desk and asked if they'd give me a trial. No, no chance. They said rather unkindly I was probably too old for the game. But it's all right, I can cope. Can I say personally a big thank you to Diane for coming here today and chairing this rally, but also for the way in which she's coped with the most unbelievable levels of abuse and harassment. And the dignity with which she's borne all of that. There is no place in our politics for any form of harassment, abuse, misogyny, or racism in any form. It simply devalues the debate and the argument. And I hope that our public life can be conducted in a better way, where we just do not indulge in that sort of behaviour. As far as I'm concerned, I'm not getting in the gutter with anybody because there isn't time, space or inclination. I want to get the policies and the issues out there for people to understand things. And can I also say huge welcome to Gareth and Sally, our two candidates for Northampton. Come on, give them a cheer. And we're going to be here a few times, all right? Because I want to see them both elected. And can I say thank you to all of you for coming here today. On Monday, we'll be treated to the farce of Boris Johnson's Conservative government amid all the full pomp and ceremony, setting out an agenda to Parliament that he has no intention and no obvious means of delivering. because this government isn't going to put any legislation before Parliament. It has a majority of minus 45. But there is one area where Boris Johnson has a 100% record, and I commend him for it. That is, he's been defeated on every vote he's put to Parliament since he became Prime Minister. And is seeking a general election which will rapidly end the parliamentary session that the Queen is about to open. Holding a Queen's speech before he's trying to call an election is a cynical stunt. He's using the Queen to deliver a pre-election party political broadcast for the Conservative Party. And it wasn't long ago that Johnson was pretending not to want an election. Now he's pretending that it's Labour doesn't want one. Let me address him directly. Prime Minister, we can't trust you not to break the law because you've got form. We can't trust you not to use this period of an election campaign to drive our country off a no-deal cliff edge that will crash our economy, destroy our jobs and industries, create shortages of medicine and food supplies, and endanger the peace process in Northern Ireland and damage the Good Friday Agreement. So it's simple. Obey the law, take no deal off the table, and then let's have the election. We're ready. We're ready. There is only one reason it hasn't happened yet. We can't trust you. We might just be weeks away from the first Queen's speech of a Labour government. And that Queen's speech will be very different. We'll put forward the most radical, hopeful, people-focused programme in modern times, a once-in-a-generation chance to rebuild and transform our country. It will let the people decide on Brexit, build an economy that works for all, change government so that it works for you, tackle the climate emergency, and reset our global role to one based on peace and human rights. So today, I want to give you a preview of Labour's plan for real change. The first task of a Labour government will be finally to get Brexit sorted. After 3 years of Tory failure, it's time to take a decision out of the hands of politicians and let the people have the final say. So a Labour government will immediately legislate for a referendum. That referendum will not be a rerun of 2016. No one knew what a deal with the EU would look like back then, and the prospect of no deal was dismissed out of hand by leaving lead campaigners, including Boris Johnson and Michael Gove at the time. This time, the choice will be between leaving with a sensible deal or remaining in the EU. Two clear options, both agreed with the EU. No false promises, no bluster. So within 3 months of coming to power, a Labour government will secure a sensible deal based on the terms we've long advocated and discussed with the European Union, trade unions and businesses, including a new customs union, a close single market relationship, and guarantees, absolute guarantees of rights and protections, and of course respect for the wonderful Good Friday Agreement that was reached. Within 6 months of being elected, we'll put that deal to a public vote alongside Remain. And as Prime Minister, I will carry out whatever the people decide. There's nothing complicated about that position. It's really very simple. Labour trusts the people to decide. Labour is the only party that can and will deliver a public vote. The Tories and the Lib Dems have taken increasingly extreme and frankly undemocratic positions that sow further divisions. Boris Johnson's Conservatives are pushing the country towards no deal, for which they have no mandate, which is opposed by most of the public, and which would open the way to a race to the bottom in our rights and protections to get a one-sided trade deal with Donald Trump. But Labour will get Brexit sorted and bring our country together, because years of bickering over Brexit has become a barrier to delivering the real change that this country needs. To do that, we need an economy that works for the many, not just the few at the top. Today's GDP figures show our economy is contracting. We're on the brink of recession. Productivity is down. People's living standards are lower today than they were 10 years ago. That's the Tory record. A Labour government will rebuild communities across Britain with investment on a scale our country has never known, bringing new jobs and fresh growth to every town, city and every region of England and all of the nations that make up the UK. We'll upgrade our creaking infrastructure with a £250 billion public investment into energy, housing and transport through a National Transformation Fund, and establish a national investment bank to make a further £250 billion available through loans to businesses and co-ops to get our economy moving. Grotesque inequality is not inevitable. It's a result of a deliberate effort to tip the balance of power away from workers towards the privileged elite that Boris Johnson's Conservatives represent. For too many people, work now means longer hours, more stress, and greater insecurity. Pay is still lower than it was a decade ago. The Chancellor, Sajid Javid, has said the minimum wage will not rise above £10 an hour until 2024, and only for those aged 21 and over. So a Labour government will immediately raise the minimum wage to £10 an hour for all workers from the age of 16, and will deliver the biggest extension of rights for workers our country has ever seen. We will create a new Ministry of Employment Rights and give workers a seat at the Cabinet table and strengthen the democratic voice of the workforce through collective bargaining. Every worker will have full rights on day one of a new job, entitling them to sick pay, holiday pay, parental leave and protection against unfair dismissal. A new Workers' Protection Agency will ensure all these rights are properly enforced. And we'll create a Working Time Commission to reduce the average full-time working hours to 32 a week within 10 years. And to truly rebalance power in people's lives, we need to go further. So Labour will give workers a say and a stake in their workplace by ensuring a third of the seats on company boards are reserved for worker directors elected by the workforce. And we'll require all large companies to create inclusive ownership funds, giving workers a share of the fruits of their labour by paying a dividend of up to £500 a year. Too much talent in our country is squandered, not through any fault of the individual, but because austerity has closed down opportunities for people. I believe the point of government is to do the opposite, to open up opportunities and allow everyone to reach their full potential. And that begins with education. The Tories have starved our schools of cash and, along with the Liberal Democrats, saddled a generation of young people with a lifelong debt burden. You know this yourselves from every school you go into. A Labour government will create a national education service, providing free education for everyone throughout life as a right to education, not a privilege to those that can afford it. So, we will scrap university tuition fees, give our schools the funding they need. And end the academies and free schools programme and bring all our schools into a democratically accountable system, the family of local education that can be achieved. We'll free young children from the unnecessary stress of over-testing by ending Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 tests. And because we all know, early years are actually the most important time of your life. We will rebuild what was a great achievement of the last Labour government. That was Sure Start. And introduce universal free childcare for all 2-, 3- and 4-year-olds. So they get that great opportunity of socialising and learning together before they go on to school later on. For a decade, our National Health Service has been run down, carved up and diced up, ready for privatisation. A Labour government will reverse this process. We'll repeal the Tory Lib Dem Privatisation Act of 2012, otherwise known as the Health and Social Care Act. We'll give our NHS the resources and equipment and staff that it needs, which will mean more GPs and nurses and reduced waiting times. And under Labour, prescriptions in England will be free, as they already are in Wales and Scotland. And anyone that's been through the pain of friends or relatives that have got serious, life-threatening conditions, we're going to make life-saving medicines available to all by ensuring that Big Pharma, the biggest pharmaceutical companies, can no longer hold our NHS to ransom. The prices the companies demand don't reflect the costs of the drugs they make. They simply charge as much as they can get away with. So we'll use a compulsory licensing system to secure generic versions of patented medicines and create a publicly owned generic drugs manufacturer to supply cheaper medicines to our National Health Service, saving the health service money and saving lives and ensuring that medicines are available to all, because some are not and some can only be bought at enormous cost from elsewhere. Only Labour can be trusted with the future of our National Health Service. After all, we're the ones who created it. But health is other things as well. £8 billion has been taken from social care budgets of local authorities since 2010. Just reflect on that figure for a moment. £8 billion taken since 2010, only 9 years ago. 87 people die every day while waiting for the care they need. It's a disgrace, and frankly, that we treat older people in this way has to change and has to be addressed. And so, we will introduce free personal care, providing help with daily tasks like bathing, washing, and preparing meals. This will be the first step towards creating a national care service, easing the fear of getting older, but also the fear for the families who have to give up work, opportunities and so on in order to care for older relatives. They love them, but I believe care should be provided by the public as a whole and not force individuals, nearly always women, to give up jobs and careers in order to care for older people. Let's have some dignity in our society. And if I told you that our social security system has been deliberately removed and replaced with a harsh and uncaring ethos, you might think, well, that's Jeremy, he would say that, wouldn't he? But if I told you those aren't my words, but the damning verdict of the United Nations, no less, you get a sense of the damage wrought by 9 years of Tory austerity on the lives of people in this country. Their policy of universal credit pushes people into the jaws of loan sharks, forces proud women and men to depend on food banks, and turfs families out of their homes because of the debt they've been forced into by universal credit. The Tories promised it would make work pay. But more and more people are falling into poverty, actually have jobs. So we will change the whole culture of the DWP. It will become the Department for Social Security, to give people dignity and respect. Social security shouldn't be about forcing women into the indignity of having to fill out a 4-page form to prove their child was born as a result of rape. 500 women had to do that last year. So, Labour will scrap universal credit and introduce an emergency package to immediately end its worst aspects, ending the benefit cap and what I believe to be the immoral two-child limit, and will stop what is now become 300,000 children being pushed into poverty by this system. And yes, that means the end of the disgusting rape clause as well. We'll end the 5-week wait for the first payment and end the Tories' vicious sanctions regime, and with it, the bedroom tax, because we're committed to reducing poverty. And because of our commitment to reducing poverty, we will end the benefit freeze, which has damaged so many people's lives. But we'll control welfare spending by tackling low pay and insecure work and the rip-off rents. That is where the poverty comes from. Low pay, high rents, and the freeze on benefits. That is a serious situation we will address. Social security shouldn't be subsidising bad employers and greedy landlords. Labour sees a decent home as a right owed to all, not a privilege for the few. So, we'll build 1 million genuinely affordable homes over 10 years, the majority for social rent, with the biggest council house building programme in a generation. And let me say this, today, World Homeless Day. In the 5th richest country in the world, no one should be forced to sleep rough. We all know it's wrong, and it's Labour that will end rough sleeping. After the horror of Grenfell, it's astonishing that the Tories are still failing to make our tower blocks safe. 9 out of 10 private blocks with Grenfell-style cladding haven't had it replaced yet. Grenfell happened in 2017. We will ensure that people aren't living in death traps and will deliver justice for Grenfell. They've suffered for too long. Under the Tories, our communities have become less safe. Violent crime has doubled, as Diane has explained often in Parliament. Think about that the next time you see the Prime Minister using police recruits as a backdrop for his latest election gimmick. A Labour government will increase the number of uniformed officers, PCSOs and police staff. But we know that police cuts are not the only reason that violent crime has doubled. It's also the wider impact of austerity, including the closure of youth centres, 750 of which have closed their doors since 2012, 7 years ago. Too many young people today are growing up with nowhere to go and no one to speak about their lives. I was in a youth centre last week in London. It was a lovely youth centre, brilliantly done, and the sense of creativity and imagination that was there in that centre, and the young people told me how much they valued it, and it opened their horizons and eyes to things they could do in their lives when they went there each evening after school. I want that kind of youth centre for every young person in every part of this country, including Northamptonshire, which has had so many plays. This isn't just about crime. The experiences of our youth can shape our entire lives. It should be a time to discover arts, enjoy sport and develop friendships. So we will guarantee every young person access to youth services in their community. That is the Labour pledge for young people in our society. Women have borne the brunt of Tory austerity, turning back the clock on gender equality. Labour will put women right at the heart of our programme for government, creating a standalone department for women and equalities to ensure gender equality is prioritised. Labour is the party of equality. We'll bear down on sexism, racism, homophobia, and all forms of discrimination wherever they exist in our economy and in our society. And we will deliver justice for the victims of the Windrush scandal, those wonderful people that came to this country. Diane is the daughter of the Windrush generation. And have done so much to enrich our lives and deliver us health care and so many other things. It's disgraceful the way they were treated by Theresa May and the Tories. Yesterday, the sickening anti-Semitic attack on a synagogue in Germany is a truly terrifying reminder of where hatred and racism ultimately leads to. So, we stand together as a society, as a community, against racism in any form whatsoever, be it the far right, anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. We will not tolerate it in any form in our society. We can all be united on that, I hope. Many of the measures I'm outlining today will be delivered at the local level by local councils. But local councils and local services have been gutted by the Tory government with Lib Dem support since 2010. The ultimate symbol of that is right here in Northamptonshire. Conservative-run council collapsed. Well, I'll just put it simply. A Labour government will properly fund councils and local services and restore that sense of place and pride that comes from having good local facilities and a thriving, lively high street, not a place of roller-blind shutters and closed businesses. And the same goes for the vital basic services we all rely on, which have been carved up and often fleeced by their private owners. The privatisation of our utilities, which are natural monopolies, has been a failure. People are sick of paying through the nose for a poor service, while billions are handed over to shareholders. So, Labour will bring rail, mail, water and the energy grid into public ownership. Public ownership run by and for the public, not for profit. And a Labour government will take the railways back into public ownership. We'll invest in public transport, including Crossrail for the north, from Liverpool to Hull and up to Newcastle. And we'll reinstate bus routes and establish municipal companies making free bus travel available for the under-25s while maintaining the pensioners' bus pass. Buses are a crucial part of our lives and our communities, and actually more people use buses than trains in the total number of journeys. Our public transport network is falling apart just when the climate emergency means we need it more than ever. If we're to have any hope of keeping global temperature rises to a manageable level, we need immediate and radical action. And I want to thank groups like the Climate Strikers and Extinction Rebellion for educating us and pushing this issue to the top of the agenda. The government's target of reaching net zero emissions by 2050 is too late, and the Tories are doing little to meet it. In fact, investment in clean energy has fallen now for 3 years running. A Labour government is fully signed up to a Green New Deal. We're already working closely with trade unions and the scientific community to develop the most radical climate targets in the world. In government, we'll entrench this into law by updating the Labour government's great achievement of the Climate Change Act, which Ed Miliband pushed through, with the most ambitious feasible net zero deadline consistent with a just transition for workers. The urgent need to reduce our emissions is the starting point for the green industrial revolution. We will unleash it in every part of our country, creating hundreds of thousands of good, skilled jobs across Britain and building the cleaner, healthier, more rewarding economy for the future. Yesterday, I visited a state-of-the-art wind turbine facility at Fawley near Southampton to discuss our plans for a 5-fold increase in the UK's offshore wind capacity. That alone will create 70,000 jobs. That's the kind of ambition we need, the ambition we need that will ensure we reach our targets and make our contribution to saving our planet. Under our plan, the public will take a 51% stake in the new offshore wind farms and will reinvest those profits in coastal communities and in other green measures. And the local communities will decide how that money is spent. And, let's be clear, Labour will ban fracking in this country. And we'll roll out a street-by-street insulation programme and fit solar panels to 1.75 million roofs, double large-scale solar electricity sources, and remove the unnecessary barriers that are often there for onshore wind, and ensure every single new house built is a zero-carbon home. The climate emergency is actually an issue of global security. And like other global issues, it demands cooperation and diplomacy. The invasion of northern Syria by Turkey is completely unacceptable. More violence is never the solution. To end war, you have to make peace, which is what all sides should do now. The Syrian peace process must mean peace and security for the Kurdish people too, whose voice must be included and heard. Reckless military interventions have made Britain and the world a more dangerous place. The wars in Iraq, Afghanistan and Libya, frankly, have been disastrous failures that have devastated those countries and fueled terrorism and insecurity rather than opposing it. Currently, the Prime Minister has the power under the royal prerogative to launch military action without recourse to Parliament. Boris Johnson, a Prime Minister without a majority, has talked about sending troops to Saudi Arabia to confront Iran. Another disaster in the making. I tell you this, I would be a very different kind of Prime Minister. One who is prepared to limit my own powers in the public interest. That's why a Labour government would introduce a War Powers Bill to ensure no Prime Minister can bypass Parliament to take our country to war. The alternative Queen's speech I've set out today, not in the grandeur of the House of Lords, but in the beauty of the Saints Rugby Club. And what I've set out is the most transformative, radical and exciting programme ever put before the British electorate. This is Labour's plan to change our country. It's the real thing, not the pale imitation offered by Boris Johnson and his Tory party. It's a path to a future where the economy is run for the people, not the privileged few, and a government that works for you, not the vested interests. A future where we tackle the climate emergency, and Britain is a force for peace and international justice in the world. That future is within our grasp. Together, we can build a country fit for the next generation. The future is ours to make. Friends, it's time for real change. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for such a warm reception. Jeremy has time to take a few questions before he goes on to do some visits locally. And I've been told I have to take some questions from journalists first, so bear with me. Alex Forsyth of the BBC.
Many thanks. Mr Corbyn, Alex Forsyth, BBC News.
Hi, Alex. How are you?
Thank you. Hello there. Mr Corbyn, a number of Labour MPs, including some of your shadow ministers, have suggested there should be a second referendum before a general election. So can you be clear? If a Brexit extension is secured, will you immediately commit to an election, not a referendum? And when might that be? Could that be in the days immediately after October the 19th?
Thank you, Alex. Rebecca Howarth of ITV. Rebecca? Oh, right.
Obviously, we're regional news. Should the Americans waive the diplomatic immunity for Anne Sokolas in the Harry Dunn case?
And Caitlin from PA.
Hi, good morning. With Extinction Rebellion protests up all in London again, what would you do if you were Prime Minister? Would you let them keep their would you let them keep their sites active, or would you give in to their demands?
Do what, sorry?
Extinction Rebellion, would you meet their demands?
Yeah. OK. Thanks for questions. The second referendum is what we propose in, under a Labour government when it's been elected, which would be, as I've said, not a choice between a no-deal cliff edge, but between an intelligent arrangement with the European Union and Remain. And so people would have a choice. And after all, as I said in my speech, it was Boris Johnson, Michael Gove and others that said it would be unthinkable to leave the EU without a deal. And that's exactly where Boris Johnson is taking us at the present time. We're in for a few days of shadow boxing by Boris Johnson, and a decision will hopefully come back to Parliament next week after the EU summit. At the moment, his behaviour and the language he's used suggests that he's not going to reach an agreement with the European Union. Our absolute priority, and that's why I've been talking to other opposition parties, is to make sure that no deal is taken off the table and an extension of membership is obtained, which is required in the EU No. 2 Act, otherwise known as the Ben Act. And after an election, a Labour government would introduce legislation to ensure a referendum that takes place between, as I've said, the agreement that we would reach with the European Union, and I'm very confident we could reach that agreement with them, and Remain. I have to say, in Remain, I would also want to see some reforms to the European Union. On the question you raised about the immunity, I am alarmed and very concerned about that. For somebody to be killed in our country and the person who did it then to flee to the United States and then claim diplomatic immunity is completely unacceptable. I know the family went to see Dominic Raab yesterday. We would put every possible bit of pressure we could on the United States, and if we could mount legal action within the United States, we would do so. But it's simply not acceptable for somebody to seek diplomatic immunity when somebody, a wholly innocent individual, has been killed by the behaviour of somebody else. It has got to stop. And over Extinction Rebellion, I think we have to understand the passion and the motives of those that are taking part in the protests all over the country. I don't condemn them. I recognise their passion and what they're doing, and indeed I've met very large numbers of them, from young children through to older people who fully understand what is happening to our planet and want our political system to reflect that. That's what I'm trying to do. And so the rebellion that is taking place in London and in other places, I think their right to protest has to absolutely be upheld. That is what our democratic rights are all about. But obviously, protests must be conducted in an entirely peaceful way. And every time many people sort of condemn anyone for protesting, they should think for a moment, where protest eventually leads. Your MP in Northampton, Charles Bradlaugh, in the 19th century, changed the law because he refused to accept the norm that was thrust upon him by Parliament, and the people of Northampton re-elected him several times. Those women that stood up for the right of women to vote, the suffragettes, were condemned mercilessly by almost every newspaper in the country. And they're now on postage stamps. You know how things change eventually. So let's just remember that the right of free speech, the right to protest and the right to be heard in a peaceful way is actually a very precious right that I would always want to protect as a government.
Peter Walker of The Guardian.
Thank you very
Lights
much.
are bright, we can't see you, Peter.
Oh, hello. Oh, hang on.
There you are.
Hello.
I've got you now, yeah.
You're going to be going into the election with Labour relatively low in the polls, as low as 25%. Obviously, in 2017, the polls before the election were not good, but then the vote went up an awful lot. Is it going to be difficult to do the same thing again? Because in 2017, you were facing a very unpopular PM who was basically promising more of the same, and Boris Johnson is promising kind of spending, not quite on the level the same as you, but on a similar level. Is it going to be hard to do the same thing? And on the same subject, if you didn't win this election, would you step down?
Okay, thanks, Peter. Antonello of La Repubblica.
Good morning. About Brexit, Mr. Corbyn, you talked about a sensible new deal with the European Union to put it to the people in a second referendum. As the Irish question is the crucial thing, as we see now, also during these days, do you still stick with the plan of a permanent customs union for Britain and a sort of alignment with the single market? Or alternatively, do you consider also a kind of backstop in a plan? Thank you very much.
Yep, thanks.
And Craig, BBC Radio Northampton.
Yeah, hello. My colleague from ITV has beaten me to the punch slightly on the Harry Dunn question I was going to ask, but I'll put it slightly further and ask you for perhaps your response to Donald Trump's comments overnight, in which he said that driving on the wrong side of the road could almost happen to anybody. Just wondered if you have a response to that.
On the third one, I just think that's the most crass, unsensitive comment anyone could ever make. A man died, the family are grieving, the community is grieving. Let's have some sensitivity and humanity about this and some justice. A Labour government will do everything we can to get justice for Harry's family. Peter, on your question, I never, ever comment on opinion polls, so you won't get the answer you might have been looking for about my studying of opinion polls, mainly because I don't study them. But what I would say is this. The 2017 election was called in emergency manner by the then Prime Minister, and we went into that campaign with the most radical, transformative manifesto that had ever been put before the British people. And we campaigned all over the country. And we delivered the biggest increase in the Labour vote in any election campaign since 1945. We gained constituencies, we gained seats. And I think we opened the eyes of an awful lot of people as to how the world could be differently run and be a different place. I've spent the last 2 years since that election campaign travelling all over the country. I spend a lot of time going to different towns, different cities, and I spend a lot of time listening to a lot of people. I go to community centres, I go to schools, I go to factories, I go to colleges, I go to hospitals, care homes, all kinds of places, and youth centres and so on, and I just listen to people. We have a society that's over-competitive, a society where many young people do not feel a sense of optimism and hope for the future, feel the public services won't be there for them, and to get a university education they've got to go into debt. They feel depressed and angry. The levels of mental health crisis in this country are also, in part, a product of the way people are treated in the economy of our society. So what we're saying is, I want to create a society where young people can look forward to the future with hope that they will get jobs, they will get somewhere to live, they will be able to make their contribution, and they will be able to fulfill their dreams. That is not easy. I get all of that. But the one thing this country can't afford is the level of inequality that we have. We've got the biggest gap between the richest and the poorest of almost any country in Europe, and it's getting bigger. So when the election is called, I'll be out there, Diane will be out there, the whole shadow cabinet will be out there, but more importantly, millions of people will be out there debating and discussing that election, and hundreds of thousands of Labour Party members will be out there. Creating that atmosphere and that message that things can and will be done very differently. Do we want our country run by a party that has cut, sliced and diced and privatised our public services? Or do you want the ambition, the enthusiasm and the imagination of the Labour Party and the Labour movement to create that different and better society? I'll take that message out there, and I'm very fit, very healthy, very happy, and very, very determined to win an election. And on your question about, from La Repubblica, and thank you for your question and thank you for being here today, your question about arrangements. I've had very long and actually very productive meetings with the Taoiseach to discuss the situation in Northern Ireland and the border and the future relationship. The best way of ensuring that we maintain the Good Friday Agreement and the arrangements in Ireland are by maintaining a customs union relationship with the EU outside the EU, if that's what the decision ultimately of the British people is. The alternative is tear up the Good Friday Agreement, which is an international agreement. It's not a bilateral agreement, it's an international agreement, and also head down the road of a trade deal with Donald Trump. And anyone that has looked at the way in which the United States negotiates its trade deals, think on about what that would mean to our environmental standards, to our working standards, to our climate emergency issues and so much else. I don't want to go in that direction. I want to be part of a world that's challenging the climate crisis, not being part of the climate crisis.
Now, who else would like to ask a question? If you can put your hand up.
There's a sister there. There's a brother.
This lady here in the orange blouse.
Hi. Oh, the microphone, yes, of course. Just take three.
A couple of things. I'm the daughter of parents from the Windrush generation. My mum worked in education in Haringey and actually attended lots of meetings with you, Jeremy, and remembers you well. My network know you from back then. We know you're a man of integrity, and we are disgusted by the smears about your character. We know different, and my network knows different. The second thing I want to add is that I also worked for Haringey Council back then. I accessed my employment through a scheme called JCP, Job Creation Programme, which was designed to allow BME people into government roles. And that launched my career. I worked hard and I had, you could call it success, in my chosen profession. Fast forward about 30 years, 25, I'm at the point, having worked in this country, worked in my career, that I want to start a business. So having accessed a scheme way back at the beginning of my career that seeks to redress inequality, I now find myself accessing other schemes in order to break through the restrictions against women who want to start businesses. Investment goes 98% towards male-led teams and 2% towards women who want to found businesses. Women do entrepreneurship differently, I have seen. We want to launch green businesses, we want social enterprises, we want to launch businesses that bring change to our society and our economy. And the British Business Bank are a big part of the problem, and they are presiding over this massive inequality that's helping to keep women shut out. Isn't it time that change happens? And what would you do as Prime Minister to help us? Because we're trying to increase productivity in this country.
You didn't give us your name.
My name's Karen Adams.
Karen, thank you. Should I deal with Karen's question first?
Any more questions?
Sorry, it was a bit long.
Do one more.
Let me just... Sorry. And that gentleman there.
Hello. My question is about universal credit. My friend recently got custody of his daughter. She's moved in, but he's been without money for 2 months. And basically, he has to get his daughter to school. Well, if he doesn't, he'll end up getting a fine on top of that. I'm hoping that you reverse universal credit and have a fairer scheme.
Thank you. Shall I deal with
I'll
those?
take one more question.
Okay.
Is there anybody on this side? A lady right at the back.
That's right.
Hello. All your promises for a Labour government sound absolutely marvellous, but how are you going to be able to balance the books? I mean, what is the level of personal tax going to be?
Okay, good question. Thanks for those 3 questions. Karen, first of all, thanks for your question, and my regards and respects to your mum. And thank her for all that she's done in her life for our society and our community. And I do remember those debates and discussions in Haringey about employment patterns and so on. I was a member of the local authority then, along with Councillor Bernie Grant and a number of others, and we looked at the employment patterns of the local authority, which was and probably still is the biggest employer in the borough, and it was not reflective of the population as a whole. There was an over-representation of BAME workers in the lowest paid jobs at the bottom end of the scale, if you like, and almost zero representation at the other end. And we looked at that, and we then decided we'd establish a jobs creation programme which gave an awful lot of very talented people a chance to work in a local authority for a while. Sometimes they moved on to do other things, and it began to redress that. And you know what? The authority became better as a result of it, because we had that diversity of the community represented in the employment pattern of the council. It was seen as very, very controversial at the time. Diane was doing similar things in other councils at that time. It was seen as very controversial, and later on just became an absolute norm of society. Do you know what? Discrimination is such a waste. It wastes talent, wastes resources, and creates a nastiness and a horrible atmosphere in society, and we should have no part of it. What you said about small businesses is actually very, very true, particularly BAME community businesses and women-run businesses. I had a very interesting time discussing with a group of women in Alfreton in Derbyshire the establishment of women's businesses there. And they had a women's round table, and they invited me to come and listen to them, and I spent a couple of hours listening to them and the sort of businesses they were establishing. And they all said how good it was and how fulfilling it was to be able to set up and do something on your own. It was risky, of course, but it was exciting to do it. But they also all said the problems they had of move on from a start-up to get something bigger. And I had the same experience in Stevenage, where I met a group of people that were in a start-up centre. The start-up centre was very good, but they needed to move on. They said their barriers were premises, their barriers were getting money, capital investment, in order to get the business going. Federation of Small Businesses tell me the same thing. And so what we would want to do is empower local economic development agencies, as I said in my speech, to give investment and loans to co-ops and small businesses as a start-up, because they're often the most innovative part of the economy. So when somebody has a great idea, and wants to set up a business to develop it, that's fantastic. When they want to grow, they should be given help and support to do it. Otherwise, they have to sell the business to a hedge fund, and the idea then goes somewhere else and gets made somewhere else rather than developing our economy here. That's why I'm very keen that we should do that, and in particular promote and support women in setting these things up. But also, our schools need to, I think, develop both the teaching of history and the teaching of life skills so that young people feel empowered when they leave school to go out and achieve those things. And so I want to say well done you for what you're trying to do. Thank you to your mum for what she does, obviously looking after you, but also good luck in the enterprise that you've been put forward. We're not the enemy of innovation or of small businesses, quite the opposite. I do want to make sure the workers are properly paid. I do want to make sure they have proper rights. I do want to make sure it's all environmentally sustainable. But it's those small enterprises that are actually the rejuvenation of many high streets and small towns that are suffering that sense of neglect and loss, which has meant they've had no investment for 30 or 40 years, and you get that depressing atmosphere where young people's only ambition is to leave the town. We don't want that. We want our towns fit for young people to want to stay in them and develop the local economy and society there. Thank you very much for your question about universal credit. It's a very good question, and it's quite disgraceful. So a single parent with a daughter has no money whatsoever for 2 months. What are they supposed to do? How are they supposed to survive? How are they supposed to pay their rent, feed the child, feed themselves, or anything else? It's absolutely outrageous, which is why we would legislate immediately, if legislation was required. If we can do it just by policy, we would, to end the 5-week wait, to ensure immediate payments, and not drive people into the arms of loan sharks, which is what happens. And you find somebody's been driven into the arms of a loan shark, pays what sounds like a pretty high rate of interest, can't keep up the payments, and then they find themselves paying a rate of interest which is in the hundreds, if not thousands of percent, on often a very small loan. Come on, let's treat people properly and decently and give the parent and his daughter a chance to develop their lives and themselves, and her to get the education she deserves, not the stress they're getting because of the brutal way in which universal credit operates. Let's change the mood music on these matters. And thank you very much for your question. Because it is a very good and very fair question about taxation levels and taxation rates under a Labour government. Our priority is social justice. Our priority is developing our economy to provide the jobs and opportunities that people need for the future. And we'll do that through the investment fund. We'll do that through the regional transformation funds. And we'll do all of that. And we will, as I said, raise taxation in some areas. We will raise, for the big companies, corporate taxation to 2010 levels, because it's now one of the lowest in the OECD countries. There is no solution in a race to the bottom on corporate taxation. There is a solution in taxing people fairly. And any other tax rises that occur will only affect the wealthiest 5% of the population. This is not going to be a government that raises taxes for the vast, vast, vast majority of the population, but will be a government that is absolutely dedicated to reversing inequality and injustice in our society. We've had 10 years of frozen wages. We have hundreds of thousands of children, increasing numbers every year, living in poverty. We have a growth of food banks, a growth of rough sleeping. We need to turn things round, invest in all our people for the future. There's no greater waste of human resources than forcing people to try and survive in poverty. Let's end that poverty and give everybody a real chance, and elect a government that gives them that chance. Thank you very much.
Jeremy has to go on to a visit, so I'm going to draw this event to a close, but not without inviting a candidate for Northampton South and our candidate for Northampton North onto the podium.
Gentlemen at the end, ladies in the middle. Give me a clap, come on, we're going to win Northampton.
carrying them on the campaign trail. Thank you for coming today and taking our message of real change with a radical, hopeful, people-focused programme to rebuild and transform our country out there. And I am confident that the next time I'm in Northampton, Jeremy Corbyn will be Prime Minister. Thank you very much.